Hey, Larkin Rose here, and this is part 4 of my series entitled Slave Think, which is looking at a bunch of excerpts from the works of Frederick Douglass in his autobiography, who, again, grew up and lived much of his life as a slave in the antebellum South of the U.S. Now, I know some people are already going to be like offended and shocked that how dare you compare our democratically elected constitutional republic to slavery? How dare you pretend that politics and elections and democracy and government that serves the people, blah, 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 has anything in common? How dare you try to compare the psychology and the principles of that? So, if you're getting all huffy at me for comparing slavery to politics, here's Frederick Douglass comparing slavery to politics. Quote, these are his words, "It was called by the slaves the Great House Farm." So that's the place you want to be if you're a slave. Few privileges were esteemed higher by the slaves of the out farms than that of being selected to do errands at the Great House Farm. It was associated in their minds with greatness. A representative could not be prouder of his election to a seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of the out farms would be of his election to do errands at the Great House Farm. They regarded it as evidence of great confidence reposed in them by their overseers, and it was on this account, as well as a constant desire to be out of the field from under the driver's lash, that they esteemed it a high privilege, one worth careful living for. He was called the smartest and most trusty fellow who had this honor conferred upon him the most frequently. So he's still a slave, but you get to be the higher ranking slave. You get to be the important slave and the privileged slave, and you should be proud of that. The competitors for this office, the slaves trying to get, chosen to work there, sought as diligently to please their overseers as the office seekers in the political parties seek to please and deceive the people. The same traits of character might be seen in Colonel Lloyd's slaves as are seen in the slaves of the political parties. End quote. Frederick Douglass. Having been a slave, he recognizes the patterns of, oh, you're just kissing up to a control freak tyrant, and if he lets you be at a higher level of subservience, then you're going to be all proud of yourself, whether that's in politics or as a literal slave. So just thought I'd throw that in there. Now, as I'm sure most people watching my channel know, I am an anarchist. Now, that scary word to a lot of people connotes bomb-throwing chaos, every man for himself, which has absolutely nothing to do with what I believe or with what the term means. Voluntarist is the less scary term, which means I want all human interaction to be voluntary, not by coercion, and that force is only justified to defend against violent aggressors. It's not okay to use violence in the name of the common good or anything else if you're not being attacked or defrauded or anything like that. That's like the super simple version of what I believe in. But of course, the term anarchy has this very negative connotation. Who do you suppose benefits from the word anarchy, meaning literally rule by no one, as in the absence of a ruling class, and also meaning chaos and mayhem and destruction? Maybe the people who want to rule us, they want us to associate not being ruled with chaos and mayhem and violence. Well, guess what? Quote, this is from Frederick Douglass. "Every little while I could hear something about the abolitionists. It was some time before I found what the word meant. It was always used in such connections as to make it an interesting word for me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, or if a slave killed his master, or set fire to a barn, or did anything very wrong in the mind of a slaveholder, it was spoken of as the fruit of abolition. Hearing the word in this connection very often, I set about learning what it meant. Gee whiz! So they wanted the slaves associating the concept of abolition and the abolitionists with chaos and violence and being bad and horrible, instead of actually conveying what it was. And he's talking about the fact that, well, I know it has this negative, scary, violent connotation, but I didn't actually know what it meant. A slave not knowing what abolitionism was in reference to, abolishing what? And he talks about how he learned it, which I'm not going to give all the details to, but I will include this part. I did not dare to ask anyone about its meaning, meaning the word of abolitionist, for I was satisfied that it was something they wanted me to know very little about. Does that sound familiar? Don't look into anarchism. It's chaos and scary and death and horrible and vote for one of these guys. And then he talks about reading stuff and finding articles, and because he learned to read along the way, illegally, criminal that he was, and then started to piece together, well, what is abolitionism? What are they trying to abolish? Because the idea of people saying slavery is entirely wrong, we should do away with it, was a completely foreign concept. He had to find out there was such an idea in the abolitionists and introduce himself to this weird foreign thing that had always been associated with chaos and mayhem and violence. So he read a bunch of stuff and slowly learned what it meant. Quote, "From this time I understood the words abolition and abolitionist and always drew near when that word was spoken, expecting to hear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The light broke in upon me by degrees." So it took a while for him to learn what it meant and understand the concept. Some people don't think I should be anybody else's property. They're not just bickering about how mean the masters should be. They all the way want to end slavery. And this is weird whispers associated with some term that sounds scary, and it's always associated with negative stuff. Gee whiz, what does that remind you of? There would be chaos if not for government. Anarchy means violence and destruction and mayhem. So I'm going to jump forward to when he was free, when he got up north and had a job and was working and I read in the last part how thrilled he was at the idea of, I can work hard and I get to keep what I produce. I'm the one being rewarded by my efforts now. And it's the most freeing thing he ever felt, and made him happier than he had ever been and could imagine being, like I read the last time. But I wanted to throw in this thing because it's also going to sound pretty dang familiar to anarchists. Because what are we always told? Well, without government, it's a brutish life and violence. It's every man for himself and poverty and a caveman existence. Without a ruling class, without our masters keeping us civilized and productive, we would just all be killing and eating each other. And there's a lot of people that picture that as what would happen without a ruling class. Just like the slaves were taught that if you weren't under the control of a slave master, you'd be dumb, violent animals, just starving to death and violently attacking each other all the time. You need slavery to keep you in line. So let me read to you Frederick Douglass's experience of what he saw when he went up to where there wasn't slavery. Quote, "I had very strangely supposed, while in slavery, that few of the comforts and scarcely any of the luxuries of life were enjoyed at the North compared with what were enjoyed by the slaveholders of the South. I probably came to this conclusion from the fact that Northern people owned no slaves. I supposed that they were about upon a level with the non-slaveholding population of the South. I knew they were exceedingly poor, and I had been accustomed to regard their poverty as the necessary consequence of their being non-slaveholders. Well, if you don't have slavery and you don't own slaves, of course you're going to be poor, right? He continued, quote, I had somehow imbibed the opinion that in the absence of slaves, there could be no wealth and very little refinement. But who will pick the cotton? And upon coming to the North, I expected to meet with a rough, hard-handed, and uncultivated population. You mean like we'd have if we didn't have a ruling class? Living in the most Spartan-like simplicity, knowing nothing of the ease, luxury, pomp, and grandeur of Southern slaveholders. Is that not a perfect description of what a lot of statists think would happen without a government? Well, it'd be every man for himself, and we'd all be struggling to survive. So, Frederick Douglass then goes through in detail, and I'm going to skip this part, feel free to go read it yourself, of him observing the grandiose shipyards and all the beautiful, amazing things and all the wealth and prosperity all over the place without anyone being enslaved, no one being coerced to work, and yet people were doing fine. Quote, this is his description of the North that he did not expect. And he's talking about the shipyard in this case, a place that he worked before and then worked now. Almost everybody, but 2 words, seemed to be at work, but noiselessly so compared with what I had been accustomed to in Baltimore. There were no loud songs heard from those engaged in loading and unloading ships. I heard no deep oaths or horrid curses on the laborer. I saw no whipping of men, but all seemed to go smoothly on. Wow, you mean life can continue without violent coercion and aggression? Who'd have thought? Quote, every man appeared to understand his work and went at it with a sober yet cheerful earnestness, which betokened the deep interest which he felt in what he was doing, as well as a sense of his own dignity as a man. To me, this looked exceedingly strange. So somebody in slavery having a really hard time imagining that there could be wealth and prosperity and peace and happiness without slavery. This is somebody on the losing end of the deal. It's not some slaveholder going up north and going, wow, you guys are doing fine. It's a slave going, wow, you can have prosperity without owning people? And so he's just looking around marveling at all this wealth and prosperity, quote, such as I had never seen in any part of slaveholding Maryland. The wealth where there weren't slaves was already way better than the slaveholders had it where there were slaves. But who will pick the cotton? So the idea that, no, we need coercion for prosperity, no, you stinking don't. Even when they were all the way owning people, it still didn't make them richer. And it also destroyed their souls, as I explained in a previous episode of this. Quote, back to his words, everything looked clean, new, and beautiful. The people looked more able, stronger, healthier, and happier. I was for once made glad by a view of extreme wealth without being saddened by seeing extreme poverty. Now, I know there's a lot of people who they will complain about the super rich today, and I'm all in favor about complaining about people who got rich by way of government coercion, which is a lot of the people who are super rich. But the idea that, well, without government, you wouldn't be either. We'd be starving and it would be chaos and mayhem. But the fact that he could appreciate, wow, look at the gloriousness of the rich people, and when there isn't violent coercion and enslavement, there isn't extreme poverty. Gee whiz. And I could do an entirely different video series on the fact that the poverty you see now and the homelessness and the hunger is 100% a result of government. Government, stupid regulations and laws making it so difficult to just build a little thing for somebody to live in. Or to rent something for like $1 a day. Like, I could personally build housing for thousands of people, charge them $1 a day, and make money off of it. But I'm not allowed to because of government restrictions and laws, including on my own property. I'm not even allowed to do that. Thanks to government protecting the poor. Anyway, that could be another gigantic topic. But back to Frederick Douglass's words, quote, "But the most astonishing as well as the most interesting thing to me was the condition of the colored people, a great many of whom, like myself, had escaped thither as a refuge from the hunters of men. I found many who had not been 7 years out of their chains, living in finer houses and evidently enjoying more of the comforts of life than the average of slaveholders in Maryland." So this is a slave observing a bunch of his fellow former slaves, not descendants from like 200 years ago of this horribleness, but like the people who were actually slaves 7 years ago. And when given a chance at actually free trade, because it was pretty damn close to free trade up north. There weren't taxes and regulations on everything under the sun. There was already a parasitic ruling class, but there was nowhere near the level of robbery and tentacles and everything that there is now. So the antebellum North was freer then than it is now, by a lot. And this guy was seeing his fellow slaves who, remember, it was illegal to teach them to read. Now, a bunch of them found ways to learn that anyway. You know, you talk about handicaps and obstacles. You start as somebody else's property and you're whipped. You're physically and mentally and psychologically just tortured and abused and oppressed and dominated your whole life. And those same people, he saw a bunch of them the moment they got their hands on freedom, doing perfectly well. And in fact, doing better, some of them doing better than the people down south who owned slaves. That is the power of actual freedom, which, by the way, we do not have now. We have nothing like economic freedom in this country, or in any country for that matter. But land of the free, America. No, you can't do anything without permission. You need a license to do almost anything. And the moment you do anything productive, they come along and they want to cut and they want to steal this and steal that and tax you for the property you already bought and tax you for everything you buy and tax you for earning the money before you went to spend it where they could tax it again. They're robbing you at every turn. We have nothing like an actually free economy. They now steal way more productivity than they did in the time of overt slavery, because now they have subjects who are way more productive. I was talking about that before. But to imagine being a slave who literally couldn't imagine anyone being prosperous without slavery, not just couldn't imagine the slaves being prosperous, like to him that was the most amazing thing, is these people were somebody else's property 7 years ago. And now they're richer than the people who owned them 7 years ago. They're doing better and they're surrounded by happy, productive people, white and black and everything else. Not only could he not imagine how well off the former slaves would be, he couldn't even imagine the rich non-slaves being rich without the institution of slavery. He thought all the white people were going to be as poor as the poor people down south. Because without slavery, how could they possibly be prosperous? And then he gets up there and wow, not only are the white people just as prosperous and more so without having to own anybody. But the people who used to be supposedly owned by somebody else down south are now richer than the people who owned them. How could this have happened? Freedom. Freedom is how it stinking happened. Because economically, well, this is a sad statement and it's absolutely true. Economically, the people he describes who were slaves a few years ago had way more economic freedom when they got up north than anyone in the U.S. does today. The people who had been slaves a couple years earlier had more economic freedom than anyone in the country does today, because they didn't need a license for anything, and they didn't need for everything. They didn't need to be taxed at every turn and robbed constantly, and using currency that's constantly going down in value by way of the hidden tax known as inflation, which is just fraud and counterfeiting. But that's another discussion. But it's so important to point at this, because when people say, I can't imagine a world without government. Okay, if you've never seen that, I sympathize. And if you have trouble imagining it because you've never seen it, I sympathize. Keep in mind, somebody who grew up as a slave, who couldn't imagine anybody, black or white, being prosperous and happy without the institution of slavery, the same thing that abused and enslaved him for much of his life. He thought that institution was essential for prosperity. Now, if he can think that and then learn otherwise, go up north and go, wow, they don't need to own people. All of this is going on by voluntary exchange. People are doing their jobs. And he talked about a friend of his who helped him out up there, and how rich he was and how educated he was and how philosophically enlightened he was. And he was still a laborer. He still worked with his hands and was doing fine. And Frederick Douglass was just mesmerized and amazed that, this is the manual laborers are happy and prosperous just because they don't have the blight of slavery and the parasitism that goes along with that in the way. And the fact that he couldn't imagine prosperity without the institution of slavery. Maybe that's a reason for lots of you people out there who are still playing the game of politics and believing in government to use your imagination a little bit more and see if you can imagine a world of prosperity and happiness and voluntary interaction without the institution of government, without a giant, violent, parasitic ruling class constantly controlling and restricting and limiting and interfering with everything and robbing everybody at every turn. Literally every turn. When you earn it, they want to cut. When you spend it, they want to cut. If you sit there looking at it, they're still going to take a cut by way of inflation. The value of the money you're sitting there looking at is going to be going down. When you die, they're still going to want a cut of that. And the fact that so many people still have a hard time picturing a prosperous, happy society without that, without a giant, violent, evil leech. And not only is it stealing all that wealth, but it's doing the most destructive stuff you could possibly do with that wealth. You would be doing the world a way bigger favor to just burn your money rather than giving it to the IRS. Because at least burning your money doesn't fund dependency. It doesn't fund mass murder on the other side of the world. It doesn't fund corruption and violence and all manner of authoritarian BS. It would just be burning it. You'd lose it, but the worst people in the world wouldn't be gaining it. But a lot of people still are stuck in the mindset where they can't imagine a prosperous and happy society without a giant gang of thieving psychopaths. How sad is that? Well, it's exactly as sad as somebody who was owned as a slave having trouble imagining a prosperous society without the institution of slavery. Because at the end of the day, it's the same frickin' thing. And the fact that the victims of the robbery now are way more comfortable, we get to work at the great farmhouse, doesn't change the fact that they are viewed and treated as cattle, as human livestock by the ruling classes, who just got smart enough that now they don't do it by brute force, and now they make sure that their victims have something to lose to keep them in line. And, of course, I have to drop in a mention again of the Jones Plantation, because that covers a lot of this. And it's very concentrated dose of reality, covering a lot of these little tidbits in the context of a fictional story. I mean, it's kind of fictional, and it's kind of not. Anyway, so once again, I'll mention that on August 5th, we're having the online watch party, and after that, anybody will be able to buy it online. I think it's like the next day the movie goes on sale. So if you want to check all that out, it's jonesplantationfilm.com. So, yeehaw. There will be, I think there's going to be at least 2 more in this series of Slave Think, because I go through the things that Frederick Douglass wrote. And this is in his short autobiography. He's written a bunch of other stuff. And there's just so much in there that applies today just as much as it did back then. The context is different. The details are different. The mentality and the psychology of the dominator and the dominated is exactly the same as it's always been. So there's a lot to learn by finding out what slavery was really like, how the slaveholders really thought and really behaved, and how the slaves really thought and really behaved, because it's still how people function today. So that's enough for this rant. Tune in for part whatever we're up to. I guess this is 4, so the next one will be part 5 about Slave Think.